to welcome you back to Exploring a Postmodern Gospel. This session, we're going to take a deep look into the human imagination. If the root problem is our capacity to construct a false reality that invalidates the self, how does humanity attempt to solve that problem? What are the patterns that we can identify in the story? During this fourth session, we will be processing chapters 6 and 7. Please post at least one question or observation regarding these chapters in the discussion boards. Then post a response to at least two other participants' questions or observations. At some point this session, finish reading chapters 8 through 9. I also want to invite you to answer this session's question in the discussion boards. This session's question is a little bit more personal. I wanted to give you the opportunity to wrestle with human imagination in your own context. Once again, I want to invite you to close your eyes and use your imagination for a moment to step into the God imagination. This is life from God's perspective. God first sees you as good. God began the world by embedding into you a deep sense of worth and value. You are created in God's image. You are a child of God. This is your original identity, and you are called for a deeply meaningful purpose, which is to rule over yourself. You are called to live into this purpose on a moment-by-moment basis. God has gifted you with a deep sense of freedom because you are not defined by what you do. Circumstance cannot change your value, your identity, or your purpose, but it can affect you. If you lose sight of your value, you will experience a profound sense of pain and suffering that can often feel overwhelming. But when you hold on to that good, which is established by God, you know it to be true because you will experience a deep sense of peace and harmony with yourself and with others. This is your terra firma, your ground of being. This is God's perspective of what is true. If you want to stop the presentation, simply press the space bar. Feel free to rest in this reality for a moment. I want to encourage you to post a response in the discussion boards regarding what you experienced. Please take the time. When you are ready, you can always come back to this presentation. This week we're going to be exploring the human imagination. As human beings created in the image of God, it is natural to assume we would then act like God in some creative way. We hold an immense capacity to construct a reality and then judge that reality. The story suggests that humanity encounters a test of reality and gets the one question wrong. When we lose sight of God's reality, we lose sight of what it means to be human. If the root problem is our capacity to construct a false reality that captivates and invalidates us, how do we attempt to solve that problem? What are the common patterns we use to deal with these false perceptions? This drive is the search for validation. Another way to see it is, if everything in the kingdom of God is good, which shows up like a circle, how do we get outside the circle? The story reveals that we construct a false reality that sees us as outside of God's love. Humanity consistently believes it is without God's favor. This week we're going to explore some of the common ways we attempt to get back into the circle. How do you get back into the kingdom of God? This is the question we've been asking forever. The assumption we make is that we are on the outside of the gates, and if we assume we are out, if we agree that it is true, from our perspective we are. When we construct a reality, it's true for us. This is the postmodern problem. We can't simply ignore our own experience regarding how we see the world. We feel unloved. We feel invalidated by circumstance. We feel isolated from community. We feel less than. And who suffers the consequences? We do. So when the traditional gospel story tells us that we're supposed to feel good about God appeasing his own sense of justice by demanding the death of his own son for something we didn't even have part of, it seems irrelevant. What we're looking for is something that helps inform us of what it means to be human. God's question is different. From God's perspective, nothing has changed because humanity can't change reality. They can't get outside the circle. But God also recognizes they are captivated by the lie. They are captivated by a false reality they have constructed. So the question for God is, how do you convince someone they are loved when they have convinced themselves they are not? How do you convince someone that they are already inside the circle? And immediately we think, why doesn't God just tell them, hey, everything you are believing right now is a lie. And while the story does suggest that God identifies the curse, it's important to recognize that this is a test of reality for humanity. We are the ones who have to wrestle through the test. We are the ones who must overcome. It's also easy to miss that the experience of the garden is not a drama, it's trauma. It's this complete disconnection from what is true. Humanity is being blinded by a false reality, and their bodies are no longer operating from a sense of reality or what is true. I explore in the book how the brain processes a sense of reality and the construction of judgment, but I want to call out the specific idea of confirmation bias. Have you ever run into someone who is biased towards something, like Coke or Pepsi, for example? Well, it turns out the brain is naturally wired for bias. When we construct a judgment and store it on our long term memory, the body automatically searches for evidence that supports what is already there and ignores evidence that contradicts it. This biological bias works in a state of wholeness, but when a lie is implanted, it wreaks havoc on the human soul. It's why we feel a sense of conflict when a good friend tries to change our mind. We're wired to defend our position. We're bent towards our preconceived notions. What's surprising about the story is that once the initial scene of the crime is over, God is over it. The story moves on to their children. God doesn't immediately provide a religious system to deal with it. There are no new commandments to fill in the gaps. There's nothing that we would think of as the law to inform them of how to live. The story just shifts to Cain and Abel. We read this strange little story of Cain inventing this idea of giving God a gift. And what the story is doing is giving us insight into how humanity acts when it is under a state of captivity to the lie. We assume God doesn't like us. So if God doesn't like us, how do we win God's favor? The story of Cain reveals that we use a bribe. And what is fascinating about the gift is that it's not even that good. That's how our mind works from a state of oppression. We give as little as we have to get what we want. And it's important to call out that God never asks for the gift. Cain invents the idea. The problem is that his brother follows along. But Abel is not captivated like his brother. He presents a gift that recognizes the good in his life. He can give the best because he already has the best. So the comparison creates this strange problem for Cain because God doesn't accept his gift. In essence, God calls his bluff, and this is the first time the story calls out the word sin. And the story relates it to the judgment of the self. In other words, once again, the story locates where the problem is for us. And notice what God does. God calls Cain to master or rule over his own imagination. God draws him back to his original purpose. But he can't do that because he's captivated by a lie. Cain becomes so jealous of God's favor over Abel that he kills him. This is the second death, the moment that humanity discovers that life can end. The human experience has an expiration date. This is a provocative piece of data for humans to encounter because what's the one thing we don't know? What happens after we die? And it is here that we must confront our preconceived notions of justice. This is the first documented account of murder. Cain kills his brother in cold blood. The ground cries out with the evidence, but the story presents an entirely counterintuitive response. In the first documented moment of murder, God does nothing punitive. God essentially lets him go. Why? This is the moment in the story when our perceptions are written. This is when God's response is the most important because we get a glimpse of what is true. And it is here that we begin to comprehend God's notion of justice. If we examine the dialogue between God and Cain, God doesn't ignore the event. God calls out what is true. God calls out the evidence of the act. The act cannot define Cain, but Cain tries to ignore it because he believes it can. Unless he acknowledges the act, unless he calls out what is true, he can't transcend it. True justice begins with calling out the reality of the act, but it also transcends it by holding on to the dignity of the individual. God never loses sight of what is fundamentally true, which is the reality of good. Even in the act of murder, one of the most horrific acts that ends a life, God never loses sight of Cain's dignity. God immediately begins with grace. It's also important to call out the fact that God does not send Cain away. Cain misunderstands God and runs away. So many times I've had people say to me, But God curses Cain and sends him away, and that is not what is happening in the story. Cain experiences the same thing his parents did. He becomes overwhelmed by the evidence. All God does is call out the reality that every time he looks on the ground, he will be reminded of what happened. Why? Because he won't acknowledge it, so he will never let it go. This state of captivity is what leads to the downward spiral. As long as we hold on to the lie, our bodies will search for evidence to support what captivates and oppresses us. The root problem is an embedded, captivating story located in humanity. All of humanity gets caught up in its own judgment of evil. The fruit of that judgment is what we would call wickedness. It's humanity destroying itself. The Lord saw how great man's wickedness on earth had become. And God's response is telling. God grieves. There is no word for anger here. In fact, there is no word for anger from God's perspective for the first 2,500 years. And then the story calls out someone. If we misunderstand the problem and where it is located, we miss a deeply important detail as to why God chooses Noah. Noah took the risk to overcome the judgment of evil and look directly into the face of God. Have you ever looked into the face of someone you've wronged? It's hard. It's easy to assume Noah was perfect, but he wasn't. The story presents him as blameless, which is different. In other words, he refused to cast the problem outward. Noah owned his own stuff and still found favor in the eyes of God. He got it right. There was no sacrifice, gift, or atonement presented by Noah. He didn't try and bribe God. And it is here that we find our meaning of the word righteousness. It begins with aligning our lives to God's perspective. No matter what Noah had done, he didn't lose sight of God's reality. He didn't turn his face away in shame. He held on to what is true. He didn't earn it. He simply accepted it. Those who are restored learn to cross the chasm. They engage God in relationship. They overcome their own judgments of the self and discover reality. Unfortunately, the story reveals that Noah is the true exception. Not because he's special, but because he simply took the risk. What is often missed is that the first 11 chapters of Genesis represent 2,100 years. Like a great novel, the story only gives us the details that really inform us about something really important. And in this first section, God only talks to 5 people. And the central problem is humanity wrestling with and being overcome by their own false judgments. God remains largely silent. But it's important to ask why God steps back. If our historical assumptions about the problem are true, we would expect God to rush in, demand a punitive response, a sacrificial way of living, and pour out his anger. But none of these responses happen. God doesn't even provide a system of atonement for people to get back to God. If the chasm is created by the injustice of breaking God's divine law, God doesn't seem in much of a hurry to help people get back over. This period of silence is either God not caring or it has some other deeper purpose. And if we understand the root problem, it allows us to infer that God is essentially allowing humanity to remain in the test, to be. Humanity is working out how it will solve the problem. This process of working it out becomes known as the way of the world. It's how humanity attempts to solve the problem on its own. And in the way of the world, we essentially see 5 patterns emerge: pride, social comparison, relationship, the law, and religion. Pride is the human attempt to validate the self using subjective means. Comparison essentially says, I'm better than you, and manifests in the idea of empire, or might makes right. Relationships is the process of finding our validation through the other. The law was a way of saying, I can do it right, and religion was a human construct to bribe God to gain favor. The first and most obvious way of the world is the concept of pride. Pride is often thought of as a moral problem, and when we understand the root problem, we misunderstand why pride is a problem. Pride is not a moral issue, it's a pragmatic issue. How do you validate what has already been validated? When we begin with the idea that we need validation, we continue to seek out what we already have, which automatically invalidates the self. Pride essentially continues the root problem. By expressing the need to validate the self, we are agreeing to and perpetuating the problem. We're creating our own oppression. Pride doesn't work because our basis is always based on something subjective, which means it can and will change over time. It's usually based on something we have or do, like beauty, brains, physical assets, or money. The more we have, the more important we are. And it's important to say that pride is not the same thing as loving the self. Pride is always based on the subjective, where love is always based on the objective. So when we love the self, we're not basing it on something we do, but on the declaration of God's perspective. We're simply acknowledging what is already true. Social comparison is essentially a subset of pride. We find some means of comparison and measure ourselves against someone who has less. The problem is that we can always find someone who has more. And what is intriguing is that those who have the most are not always happier or more satisfied. In many cases, the opposite is true. Within social comparison is the concept of empire. One of the most tangible assets is physical strength, which forms the idea that might makes right. The strong rule over the weak. Empire became one of the central issues of the Mesopotamian culture. The third common pattern to validate the self is to seek out the validation of the other. We find someone who will approve of us. We grant someone in our lives the authority to validate us. And when we lose that validation, as in romance, it often becomes devastating to the individual. The four common people we typically seek out validation from are mother, father, teacher, and preacher. They are the common means of authority in most communities. What is interesting is that we can easily miss that we approve of the people who are allowed to speak into our lives. So if the authority fails in some tangible way, we can come to question their ability to validate us, and thus lose our sense of validation. The fourth common pattern was the law. Within community exists an interesting idea. What if there was a code or law to deal with the idea of escalating violence? What if we could agree on an acceptable list of actions? So a man named Hammurabi invented a code to do just that. It was a subjective moral structure that was agreed upon in community. It existed almost 500 years before God gives the Ten Commandments, and it was remarkably similar to the basic ideas in the Jewish law. It essentially reduced violence by creating the idea of an eye for an eye. The law was determined by the few for the many. It was culturally based and relevant to the present day. In other words, it was subjective. And you had to use force to keep people from breaking the law. The law went hand in hand with empire. But what if you could keep the law perfectly? What if you could keep all of the commandments? That would be pretty special. Your command of life would be pretty profound. You might just be a god, because inside you knew that you couldn't keep it. In the quiet places of your life, you knew that you had failed in some way. You knew that you had never met anyone who, if they were honest, was perfect. But arguably the most important human development was the invention of religion. By the time we get to Abraham, religion is deeply embedded into the Mesopotamian culture. And as Cain taught us, the central idea of religion is to appease or bribe the gods. If we want the favor of the gods, we had better come up with something special. And so what we see in the development of religion is the development of the sacrificial system. It's logical to assume that as Cain settled into east of Eden, he took this idea with him. And if the sacrifice is for the gods, it was important to know someone who knew what would appease the gods or who would perform it for you. We needed to know we were getting it right, so a priestly class was born. All of this is deeply developed before God ever talks with Abraham. Religion is based on the idea of sacrifice to gain favor, so it's also important to explore the rationale of the sacrifice. Let's say I do something that I assume makes God angry. The evidence is staring me in the face. I don't want God to be angry with me anymore, and I definitely don't want God to kill me. So what if God will accept a bribe? I can't offer myself because that wouldn't solve the problem. I need a substitute to take my place. So what do I have that is valuable? Well, I have my assets, things like my money, my animals, and even my children. Within the Mesopotamian culture were gods who actually demanded the death of children. But within my family as an order of importance, I can give the gods my sickly child, which probably wouldn't mean as much as my firstborn son. My firstborn son will carry my name and my family honor. But it gets even better than that. What if my firstborn son was exceptional and could keep the law? These are the ideas that make up the religious ideal. A sacrifice must be important and meaningful to the one who is doing the sacrificing. The more weight it carries, the more meaningful it becomes. And it is here that we must ask, who is the sacrifice for? Who needs to be appeased? God never asks for the sacrifice from Cain. And for the next 2,500 years, religion is established and embedded by humanity, not God. The central purpose of the sacrifice is to create a sense of atonement, which means at one-ment. It is to bring the individual back into wholeness by removing the source of guilt. We trade the sacrifice for the penalty. And if we understand the root problem, we can begin to understand that it is humanity that needs restoration. The sacrifice is appeasing the human projection of God's demand, not God's actual demand. The scriptures would later communicate this idea. Leviticus 5:10 states, "The priest shall then offer as a burnt offering in the prescribed way and make atonement for them, for the sin they have committed, and they will be forgiven." The atonement was not for God, it was for us. One of the really important aspects in the story is the idol. The false reality eventually manifests itself into our lives. Instead of being something inside, we project it outward and give it life. We create something tangible that we can see so we can relate to it. The idol is essentially our attempt to control the false reality or image in our heads. It's our attempt to make sense of it so we can get rid of it. But by creating it, we grant authority to it, which makes it virtually impossible to get rid of. We don't want it, but we need it because we think it validates us. As we begin to draw out the immense capacity of the human imagination, it's important that we also bring it down to real life. Part of what we're doing is bringing the gospel back into our own world to make it real in our lives. So I want to turn our attention for a brief moment to the session question. What is the one thing that you hold on to that validates you? What is the one thing that resides in your life that you can't let go of, that if you lost would invalidate you? We all have our own idols. We all have something we are sacrificing for the sake of those idols. We ask not out of duty. The purpose of this process is not to get to the expected answer, but to begin nurturing your life into a conversation of restoration. To call out that which oppresses is to begin the practice of overcoming. This practice is first for you. I want to end this presentation here so we can begin having a conversation about it in the discussion boards. Once again, much love to each of you, and I look forward to our conversation about the gospel.